Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. This is a podcast of around 10 years of ethnographic research covering around 26,000 autistic Christians and ex-Christians, and we talk about all things related to autism, Christianity, and the people who interact with it, either negatively or positively. For this episode, I have Cathy Reisenwitz with me. She's a writer. She has a Substack called Sex and the State, which is where I found her. She's also on X, formerly known as Twitter, which is another place that I found her. And she wrote an article called Feminists for Re-Institutionalization. And that is what we are going to be talking about today. So obviously, this is a fairly contentious issue. If talk about institutionalization bothers you, this is not the episode to listen to. Editing John here. This episode also contains discussion of adult topics and adult material. Do not continue. This will not do you good. If, however, you are fine with these discussions, you can keep listening. Do you want to introduce yourself more, Cathy, and explain to the audience who you are and what you do?
Yeah, totally. Thanks for having me. I'm a self-proclaimed autistic Christian. People have argued with me about whether I qualify as both, but I claim it. Sex and the State is my kind of online diary for my special interests, and I love politics and feminism, particularly like a more girl boss choice, neoliberal, sex positive feminism, centrist politics. And so I wrote about the feminist case for reinstitutionalization. I came to that from a few different angles. Feminism, obviously, also having family members who have worked with people with profound disabilities. I've done a lot of work on homelessness, and obviously homelessness and mental illness and addiction correlate. And just having lived in San Francisco as well. I mean, that's what got me on the housing and homelessness beat, and also really opened my eyes to the realities of having a large unhoused population.
Yeah, so the article is pretty short. I'll link it in the show notes if you want to read it first. But it makes the case, but there are still a lot of things in there because it's so short that I want to know more. I want to dive deeper into this. And so that's what we're going to do in this episode. Before we start that, though, I think it's necessary to give a little background about institutionalization so people know exactly what we're talking about and sort of the history and trajectory of things. This is going to focus mostly on North America, so Canada and the US, and the history of institutionalization in those countries. I'm sorry, I just don't know much about it outside of that context. So if you are in the UK or Europe and listening to this and saying, what the hell are these people talking about? It's because neither of us are from your context. I apologize. So this discussion or debate, whatever we will end up calling it, is going to be pretty North American centric. So in North America, institutionalization started in around the mid-19th century, and institutionalization was sort of a humanitarian improvement on the old system, is I think the best way to put it. There was a woman named Dorothea Dix, and she basically started to publicly advocate for the mentally ill and the disabled that were mostly in prisons or in very destitute conditions. And she thought, we must have a better place for these people. We should do something. And so she established hospitals for the mentally ill that became known as institutions. These were often paired with state schools. So state schools were places for people with mental disorders and disabilities, and that's kind of how they were for 100 years. There is a very long, often dark history of institutionalization, especially in North America. It's very closely tied with things like the eugenics movement and other parts of history that most of us consider unsavory. These places were sometimes okay, but often not very well managed or well taken care of, and the people in them were not treated particularly well. And this led to a shift in the 1950s. Lots of things happened post World War II, but a big thing that started to happen with institutionalization is a lot of the parents of people who would normally be institutionalized or sent to state schools started saying, what if instead of sending them away, we built parallel communities? And within these parallel communities, started to actually treat these people with more dignity and respect. There's a pretty famous one that some of the audience will probably be familiar with called L'Arche or the Arc. It was started in France by a guy named Jean Vanier. Unfortunately, Jean Vanier has a terrible track record of sexual abuse that came to light in, I believe, 2020. That is really bad. L'Arche investigated and condemned and distanced themselves from him, but he wrote a lot about the disabled. He was moved in the 1960s to look at the institutionalization and say there must be a better way to do this, and so he founded communities of disabled people and support workers. In 1972, there was a big scandal with institutionalization that sort of kicked off deinstitutionalization. There were some hints of it. So JFK famously had an institutionalized sister named Rosemary. But in 1972, there was a scandal called the Willowbrook scandal, where the Willowbrook institution was investigated by investigative journalists, and a bunch of news stories broke about Willowbrook. And Willowbrook was not a good place, to put it mildly. It was sort of the worst case scenario that you could imagine, and that's what it was like. The nation responded with horror, and 3 years later, the DD Act was passed in response. And the DD Act basically increased funding, oversight, and support for independent communities and independent community living and long-term services and support. In 1990, the ADA passed, so the Americans with Disabilities Act. There were parallel acts that were passed in Canada. And this basically gave rights and protections to people with disabilities. And then the big thing that sort of shot institutionalization in the head was a Supreme Court case called Olmstead versus LC, where the Supreme Court looked at two women, Louis Curtis and Elaine Wilson, and basically looked at these two people who both had developmental and cognitive disabilities. Louise had schizophrenia and Elaine had mobility loss, and they both had intellectual disabilities. And they were both deemed ready for community placement, but they were denied community placement in their institutionalized contexts. And they used the ADA to fight for their rights to live independently with community services. And they did just that after they gained their rights in this court case. And they lived independently with community support services until their death. And that is sort of the narrative that you get from the if you look at activists talking about disability that and institutionalization, that's basically the narrative you get. It is a little more complicated than that. Another big thing that was happening in the 1990s was neoliberalization, and neoliberalization started cutting funding to publicly supported health institutions. Many of them were mental institutions. Reaganomics and all that fun stuff started kicking in, and places got underfunded as well. And so institutionalization started going down in 1975. It really started to go down in the 90s. And then with that Supreme Court case, that sort of was the death knell for it. And most institutions started to close after that. So we are now sort of 20, 25 years-ish past institutionalization dying. And people have started to ask questions like, was this a good idea? Or did we overcorrect? And I think that was sort of what you were trying to do in that article, is to say, hey, wait a second, did this actually achieve what we wanted it to achieve? So I will now cede the floor to you, Cathy, unless you have anything that you would like to add to that brief history, and let you make your case.
The only thing that I would add is that I would argue that deinstitutionalization was not really like a conscious decision that was made, like, let's try this thing. It was more that Reagan reduced funding significantly for federal funding for institutions, with the understanding that then federal money would flow to states, and that states would use that federal funding to create their own solutions to the problem that institutions were solving, and that money then never came. And so what was supposed to happen didn't happen, not what was supposed to happen didn't work out. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other thing I would point out is that there's never been kind of one thing that happened to people who need help. It's always been stratified by positions of power in society. So people who had more resources, the people who they cared about got better care. And the people who didn't have people who had the ability to advocate for them always got worse care. And so as it was, so whatever has been. And so what we're talking about when we talk about how to deal with people who need help, we're really talking about the people who don't have the wherewithal to make sure that their people they care about are taken care of.
Yeah. And exactly, as you pointed out, most of the sort of extreme cases are cases of that aren't just people with severe mental health issues or significant disabilities, but also the intersection with things like race, with things like poverty, and all sorts of different intersections of marginalization.
Yes,
are all at play here. And so this is that's a good point to add to this. Anyway, so your case for reinstitutionalization, what is it? Why should we reinstitutionalize?
And I'm using institutionalization. I don't actually care. I don't have a strong opinion about whether it's institutions or group homes or however you want to get it accomplished. But the problems that I see are related, but they're not exactly the same. The first problem is that there is insufficient support for people whose family members are severely disabled and need support. And so, in many cases, they have these people in their homes, even though that's really not probably the best place for them as individuals and for society, because they don't have another place to put them. And so, I think that's a huge problem. Then the other problem is that there are people who any reasonable person would agree need to be compelled into care, and there's not a legal way to compel them into care, and there aren't enough places for them. And so those are the two problems that I think we need to solve as a society, and that I don't think that there's any perfect solution, because if money were infinite and everyone had the perfect autonomy, then these problems wouldn't exist and it would be fine. But in a reality where resources are scarce and autonomy is curtailed by disability, the bargain we're kind of living with right now, I think, is really, really bad. And I think that we would benefit from renegotiating the trade-offs that we've accepted in the status quo.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think there are a few things worth teasing out there to just get more clear what we're talking about. So when you say there are people who need to be, I forget the exact term you use, but yeah, compelled to care. What do you mean by that? Who are the types of people who you are imagining in this category? Like, how do you or what would be the criteria for that? Because obviously, like, I know a lot of people who have had compelled care, and some of them say, this saved my life. I am so glad someone was able to intervene and compel me to care at the time that I needed it. And some people are like, this is the worst experience of my life, and this should never happen to anyone again. And there is a wide breadth. So I imagine there is some nuance in the type of people who you would think should be compelled, and people who should not. So can you tease out those differences?
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, if you're coming at this from the perspective that absolutely no one should ever be compelled into care, and there's no argument that would sway me, then okay, because I can't make the argument that no one will ever, that if there is any mechanism by which we can compel someone into care, that there's any way to ensure that it's perfectly applied. Like, that's not possible. So if perfect autonomy, whatever you think that is like your number one thing, then we're not going to be able to have a productive conversation. But what I'm saying is that the costs of it being too hard to compel someone into care are greater than the costs of it being a little bit easier, right? I think it's too hard right now. And so examples that I listed in the article that I wrote are like Brendan Nepa, I'm sorry, NEPA. And so I think he was 16 years old at the time, and he beat his aide unconscious, his special education aide unconscious, fractured her ribs, gave her a concussion because she didn't let him play his Nintendo Switch. And he is a boy who his mother wrote a letter after the assault saying, we knew he was violent. The medications he was on weren't working. We said we couldn't have him in our home because he was a danger to herself and her elderly husband. He was in a group home. We told the group home he's dangerous and he shouldn't be in school. The group home sent him to school, and this is what happened. And so this is an example where you either believe that he is intellectually disabled, and so either he is just a violent, bad person who needs to be punished, or more likely he's not in total control of his faculties and needed to be compelled to be under supervision where he was not able to hurt anyone until such time as his medications or therapy or whatever was adjusted that he did not pose an imminent danger to the health and safety of the people around him. Another example is Jordan Neely, who was killed on the New York City subway because people on the train felt threatened by him. This is an example where he actually thrived in jail because that is a place where he was sheltered and he wasn't using drugs. And he was living in a group home, or actually he would cycle between group homes, jail, and the streets. And the point is, he needed to be under supervision. He was punching women in the face and being violent. An example that's come up since I published the article is the man who stabbed the woman to death on the Charlotte train. He was hearing voices. He had a history of, if not diagnosed schizophrenia, certainly psychiatric breaks. And so he had actually called the police himself asking for help before he committed this crime. And there are many, many, many examples. There's an article I read a while ago about a man who was a lawyer and very successful, and one day kind of had a psychotic break and has been living on the streets of San Francisco for many years, believes that the government is spying on him, has intermittent contact with his family, and they don't have a way to compel him into psychiatric care. And there are many, many, many cases like that where someone is either schizophrenic or there's a huge problem in San Francisco of drug-induced psychosis, particularly meth, where people are, I understand wanting to protect people's autonomy, but you can have a level of disability where you don't have autonomy, functionally speaking. And when you have situations like that, the humane thing to do for the individual is to compel them into care. And importantly, it's also the right thing to do for the rest of society as well, because these people usually only pose a danger to themselves, but sometimes also pose a danger to others.
Yeah, so it sounds like the criteria, if you sort of synthesize that answer, is a person who is posing a danger to themselves or other people or something like that. Is that a fairly good synopsis of like
The tricky
that,
thing is
or would it be
that
more
right
nuanced?
now, you can compel someone into care on that basis. So if you can demonstrate that a person poses an imminent danger to themselves or others, you can compel them into care. The issue is that to it's like a 48-hour hold, and then they're dumped out on the streets, and that's not sufficient. So we need to look at danger to themselves and others from a less imminent perspective and a more holistically, is this person able to care for themselves? Is this person a danger to themselves and others, in a more looking at it from a longer term perspective?
So I have been in disability activism spaces for many years of my life. I have many feelings about them and many of their ideas. However, when you bring up something like reinstitutionalization, the very first thing that will come out of their mouths is an objection like, this is a band aid solution. You are forcing a, a carceral solution onto a person who, in a better society, would not be this way. The goal we should have is to change society, not to use the band aid solution of incarceration or punishing a person for their disability. What would you say to that?
Hell yeah, brother. I also want a society where nobody ever needs to be compelled to do anything. And, people who are working towards that's amazing. And I love that for them. In the society we live in, the status quo is unacceptable. And so I don't think that it's acceptable to accept this status quo while we work on that society. I think we need to do both at the same time. I think we need people working on making society better, and we need people advocating for the people who are suffering now and the people who are endangered now. So that's the argument that I would make there.
Yeah, so I read your article. I have a long history of interacting with various people with different levels of cognitive abilities, and most of my experiences with autism. And I talk to a lot of disability advocates who are fierce proponents of deinstitutionalization. Most of them are fierce opponents they are fierce opponents of reinstitutionalization. And most of them are opponents because they themselves have experienced institutionalization. And many of them inappropriately have experienced institutionalization, where there were probably much better solutions that could have been used for them, and they were not, and they were institutionalized. And it's often a pretty traumatic experience for them. And I find a lot of them use this personal experience to say, look, this was a terrible solution for me. This did not help me. This made my life worse. It was dehumanizing. It was terrifying. I should not have been there. I was there. No one deserves to have that done to them. No one deserves to lose their autonomy. And I sympathize with that. I completely understand what they are saying. However, I think that lived experience can only take you so far in a lot of these cases, because these people that I talk to weren't the type of people who stab other people on trains. Just to put it mildly, they're not, and they were never in danger of that. But we do live in a society in which people have disabilities that can get very, I'll say, not pretty. So, one of my friends was forcibly institutionalized because he repeatedly threatened to sexually assault women that he would see on the street. Eventually, you sort of need to reckon with the fact that, yeah, this guy can't help that he's doing this. This is something that is happening because he has a serious mental illness. But also, while institutionalization was definitely traumatizing for you and not a great experience, you aren't that guy. And we need to do something with that type of guy. And like a lot of these cases, people have, I would say, a extremely optimistic and laudable view of people, and I applaud that. However, that sometimes gets in the way of allowing you to see what is sort of right in front of your face, which is there are a lot of violent and dangerous people, and violent and dangerous people because of their mental health conditions. It is often not pretty, it is often very sad, it is often extremely depressing and overwhelming. And as much as I, you know, sympathize with people and say, look, absolutely, you should not have been institutionalized. You need to consider more people other than yourself in this. You need to consider the sort of holistic, broad view of everything that's going on. And so the next part of the conversation that typically happens is asking, okay, so institutionalization or reinstitutionalization or deinstitutionalization. And I sort of think that's a false choice, right? I think there are spectrums and there are layers and there are various different solutions. It isn't basically institutionalization or compelled care for everyone. It is institutionalization and compelled care for some types of people, other solutions for other people. So institutionalization is pretty broad. If you talk to some disability rights activism, they will consider group homes institutional, even like small group homes with less than 10 people. They will consider those institutions. There are many different definitions. Unfortunately, a lot of the arguments that I see, I don't know if how deeply you've gone into this, Cathy, but a lot of times the arguments will be, they'll be against deinstitutionalization and arguing against 10-person group homes, and in order to argue against it they will use the horrors of what went on in like Willowbrook or something like that. And I would just like to point out these two things aren't analogous. There is typically, when you go into disability rights, there is HBCS, which is home-based community services, or no, it's HCBS, sorry. Editing John here. I will, throughout this episode, continuously mess up this acronym. Please bear with me. I don't know why. I have been talking about this for like 10 years that I cannot get HCBS and HBCS deconflicted in my mind. Home and community-based services. So this is home and community-based services are you live at home and then people come to you. So my wife works in a home community-based service as a registered nurse. Her whole job is to, once people get discharged from hospital, to go into their homes and provide them the care and support they need so that they don't get readmitted into hospitals. It's a great program. It is super efficient for everyone. It saves the hospitals money. It saves the government money because we're in Canada and we have single payer. It saves the people money, and it also saves those people mental health, like the outcomes improve. Home community-based services are great. They serve a very vital and important role. And then you have hybrid approaches as well, like that are somewhere in between that spectrum. So on the full autonomy side, you have home and community-based services. On the no autonomy side, you have compelled institutionalization. And there are many spectra in between those solutions. So disability rights activists will ask you, like, why can't we just do only home and community-based services? What would you respond with to that question?
Well, the two big reasons or the two cases is sometimes people don't have family members who are willing to be caretakers or able to be caretakers. So in the United States, if you have a severely disabled family member, you're doing the caretaking. Even if you have help, you're still having to, well, for most people don't have the extent of help that one woman I know has. So they're doing shifts, but she has all of the shifts covered She's funding part of it herself. She still has to hire the caretakers, and she supervises the caretakers, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of expense. And not everyone has somebody who's willing or able to do that for them. A lot of those people end up dead, homeless, in jail, or in jail and homeless in cycles until they die. So that's the status quo. And then there are people who have family members who would be happy to caretake for them, but they are, these individuals are not willing to stay in those homes. And so the family members are not able to legally compel them into care. And so they are also in the jail, homeless till death cycle.
Yeah. So this it's a very common thing that you see in these spaces. People go to home and community-based services. In the home and community-based services, the home and community-based services may not provide everything that they need. Things fall through the cracks, things get missed, and you end up in a cycling spiral of things going from bad to worse, and then basically never recovering from those cycles. An argument that is often put out is that, well, we just don't have enough services, but also like how would you respond to that? Is that like this cycle only happens because we don't have enough services, and if we just had more services, this wouldn't have to happen?
I don't understand. Like, there are many examples of, for example, there'll be a disabled family member and children in the home, and that disabled family member poses a danger to those children. This is not an unusual scenario. 24-hour a day security detail. I don't understand what services are supposed to make that a viable, healthy situation. You know, I don't understand.
I mean, they presumably in that case they would have their own like government provided housing or something like that, and then they would have people checking in on them in those situations. I mean, my response to that is I would love that. I would love to have infinite money to throw into the social support services. However, infinite money just doesn't exist. And I think a big thing that you said at the beginning is quite important, is that there are limited resources. We are in a resource constrained environment. And in a resource constrained environment, you often have to make decisions and choices that are reflective of the resources that you have available to you. And like you said, in some of these cases, that would mean 24/7 security supervision. And 24/7 security supervision gets really expensive for a single person. And in these cases, it is much cheaper and much more efficient and better for outcomes to not spend that money on a 24/7 monitoring service, and instead have an institution that does the job that it's supposed to do, or a group home. But again, then you have situations in which people can't stay in group homes because they are violent in the group home, and the people in the group home need to be protected. They are also vulnerable people, and this sort of just cycles and cycles and cycles. It sucks. This is reality.
That's the thing about it, is that resources are scarce and it just sucks. And there's no way to make it not suck. And what's frustrating about a lot of disability advocates is they pretend it sucks less than it does. They pretend as if these people in every case have perfect autonomy. They don't. They pretend as if resources are infinite, and they're not. Like, there's no way to make this not suck. The question is, which suck do you want? And I think the suck we have now is not good. I think until you die or kill someone, you're just out and about, is not good.
Yeah. And I often criticize disability activism with a hypothetical superhero that I call Structural Man, or Captain Structural. And he's based off of a South Park episode with a superhero named Captain Hindsight. Captain Hindsight flies in to a building that's on fire and goes, "There should have been fire escapes. We should have done this better. If we had better fire safety, this would have never happened." And he flies away. And everyone's like, "Thanks, Captain Hindsight." And the building's still on fire and the people inside are still dying.
Yeah.
And I find with a lot of activism, you get like structural man flying in and being like, the problem here is actually structural and societal wide, and it's like, great, cool, good, completely understand that. How are we going to rapidly and revolutionarily change society within like the next 10 years to accommodate this? And you start to dig into it, and it's like, well, first we'd need to abolish capitalism. It's like, well, that's not happening. Maybe you believe a communist revolution is on the horizon in the next 10 years. I do not share your either optimism or pessimism, depending on which side of the political spectrum you live on. I mostly think in 10 years we are going to have roughly the same thing that we have now, with different levels of deterioration or improvement depending on the boring sets of policies and government regulations that get implemented or lack thereof. And I mean, I think all this talk that you often get of the problem is actually structural, the problem is not with an individual, it's a problem with society. Even if that were true, that actually makes the situation much worse. If you accept that the problem is society and not the individual, that means that if you can't change society, those people are basically permanently screwed. And I just don't think that's true. Like, just as a point, I think that in general, you can improve things for individuals. Is this going to be a perfect situation? Obviously not. Like, I think you and I both agree, a lot of aspects just suck. Like, in my mind, institutionalization is a sort of last ditch attempt, or last ditch effort at the end of the line when all other options have been exhausted, because you can't really do any more interventions and you have to do something. And it's pretty much the only feasible thing you can do for a lot of people. Again, another friend of mine didn't get violent, but started developing delusions, and was constantly thinking that people were poisoning his food, and would go to restaurants and wouldn't eat anything because he was convinced people have poisoned this. He, started getting into screaming matches with his family that he lived with because he thought his family was poisoning him. And I mean, at one point, while he is not violent, while he basically takes it out on himself and turns it inward, the man isn't eating, right? And that's a problem. And there's no amount of like social change that we can make that is going to make him, no amount of changing society is going to make him think that people aren't poisoning his food, because something is going on in his head. And that thing in his head is telling him people are poisoning your food, and there's really no reasoning that you can do with it, right?
Right. Well, I used to be I'm sure I still struggle with black and white thinking, but I had very black and white thinking about autonomy, and I was very anti compulsion. And so I would have never been a fan of involuntary commitment, especially longer term, but then I moved to San Francisco. And I remember I was walking to a meeting and I saw somebody laid out on the sidewalk unconscious with blood on their head. And so I called the police, because that's what you do when you see somebody in distress. And by the time I got to my meeting, I realized if I called the police every time I saw somebody in horrible distress, I would never get anywhere in San Francisco. And, you walk past people who are screaming at people and have infected wounds on their bodies, and it becomes clear that the kind, compassionate thing to do is to step in. This person there's no definition of autonomy that means anything if this person can be said to have it. And I think with disability, it's very much similar to the autism discussions, where people who have ASD1 or whatever, high functioning, whatever we want to call it, cannot set policy for autism based entirely on their own experience. Like, that's not correct. And so it is with severe disability and mental illness. Like, if your involuntary commitment was incorrect, you're not who we're talking about. And so we can't set policy based on your experience.
Yeah. And so the next thing that will come up is basically the very long history of abuses that have happened in institutions. So there are so many case studies that you could go through. A famous one, often involving autism, is called Fairview. It was closed in 2000. A lot of people, specifically with intellectual and developmental disorders like ASD 2 and 3, were committed there. There was a lot of involuntary sterilization that happened. There was so much abuse and neglect that there were like 11 employees facing indictments for abuse. It was often described as highly regimented and prison-like, where you had no choice over your food, you had no choice over your activities. It was, you were here, you were here, you were moving. Heavy use of tranquilizers and straitjackets. There were several instances of people drowning in the pools that they had there because of insufficient supervision. And so I speak to a lot of people who have ASD1, and one of the things that happens with people who have ASD1 is they often have siblings who have ASD2 or ASD3, and they have to be their caretakers. And often from that experience, they will become PSWs or nurses or personal support workers and care workers. And so I've talked to a few of them, 11 in total, who work in care homes or work in group homes, often small group homes. And the people in those, like a lot, especially the older clients, often have like pretty bad PTSD from being in group homes. So a few of the people that I know, they aren't allowed to wear scrubs to work because scrubs remind the people in the care homes about their time in institutionalization. And there are just a lot of very sad stories that come out of institutions, a lot of overcrowding and underfunding. And it is these most vulnerable people that are affected. Like, we're talking about people with ASD1, speaking for people with ASD3, but it is often the people with ASD3 who are taking the majority of the abuse at these institutions. What would you say to those types of objections to institutionalization?
Well, again, right now the default is, if you're not in an institution, using that broad umbrella definition, you're on the streets, at home, or in jail. Do you think abuse doesn't happen in those settings? People who are unhoused are victims of violent crime and property crime at incredibly high rates. People are abused in their homes, and it's much harder to monitor that kind of abuse than it is to monitor abuse in an institution setting. And I don't think I need to tell anybody about prison, but it's not good. I would love them to make an empirical argument that abuse, that in a system where it's easier to compel care and there are more options available for care that are not homelessness, jail, or home, that the actual severity and incidence of abuse would rise in those. I don't believe that. I think it's easier actually to measure and document abuse in institutions, and that gives us a bias against them that's actually should be in their favor, the fact that it's easier to measure and document abuses in those settings.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing that you brought up there is that this isn't a choice between, institutionalization or a perfect world in which we have unlimited funding for home and community-based support services. This is, like you often said, it is institutionalization or it is on the street with no support. And on the street with no support is, I think, infinitely worse than institutionalization. And that's often the choice that people have to face. And I think the worst of two bad options is always the best choice to make. right? Like when you have a bunch of bad options, people don't like to choose bad things. But this is hopefully this isn't too army brained, but we often have a phrase, we have problems and dilemmas. Problems are solutions, or are things where there is a good solution and a bad solution, and we have to figure out what the good solution and the bad solution is. Dilemmas is where there are only bad options and you just have to choose a bad option. And I think this is a dilemma. I think we are in a you must choose a bad option. There isn't a good one here. There isn't a good plan here. We're in the trenches. Like, we're not breaking free. And as much as I would love to be in a world where we don't have to make these decisions, don't have to make these trade-offs, I think that a lot of times they are necessary. Another sort of critique that gets thrown out is that there are many people who were institutionalized who, when given home and community-based support services, thrive. So people who the cases, the big Supreme Court case, the two women in that case were institutionalized. They were deemed fit to go back into the community. They were stopped from going back into the community because of just sort of the inertia of institutions and how, navigating the bureaucracy while you have an intellectual disorder is a very difficult thing to do. And they were in there, they wanted to get out, and then once they got out, they thrived. How do we ensure this doesn't happen? Or, I'll just leave it at that. How do we ensure cases like that don't happen? Well,
you can't.
Yeah. Okay.
You cannot ensure that doesn't happen. There are ways to mitigate it, to reduce it. I'll also point out there was a situation in which New York City thought that a lot of the people in institutional care could thrive in their communities. And so they set them up in apartments and gave them a lot more autonomy, and they set their apartments on fire. And it was not, so it's hard, is what I'm saying. It doesn't just go in one direction. But one thing that California does, for example, is they appoint every person. So there's a legal mechanism called guardianship, or in California, it's called conservatorship. But the idea is that you are a person who is unable to care for yourself autonomously in some way. And so the court appoints you a person to help you navigate life. And so that could be you have dementia, or you have severe mental illness or something, and they help make sure you are handling your money properly, you're eating properly, you're getting your medicine, whatever it is that you need. And so sometimes it'll be a family member, or if one's not available, sometimes it'll be a social worker, but it'll be help. And to make sure that people are not under conservatorship who don't need to be, you are appointed, in addition to your guardian/conservator, a legal counsel who advocates on your behalf and says, this person, we believe does not need this level of support at this time anymore. And there's a regular cadence. So maybe the guardianship or conservatorship will be set for 6 months, and then it would be reevaluated. Or perhaps the legal counsel would say, we need to have another hearing. I think that this person can handle more autonomy. So that would be one way to do it, is to have preset periods of reevaluation and advocates on behalf of the disabled person to monitor when and whether the arrangement needs to change.
Yeah, so I've seen lots of arguments about this, and my usual counter argument is something like, yeah, it sounds like we were lacking oversights. It sounds like we were lacking institutional checks and balances. And the solution to a lack of oversight and a lack of institutional checks and balances isn't to get rid of the institution or the thing that has a lack of them, but to just impose them and to try to do our best to ensure that there aren't as many, right? The solution to abuse crises that happen in hospitals is not to shut down hospitals. It's to make better regulations and policies to ensure that abuses don't occur in them. When there was that major scandal where cyanide pills were slipped into Advil, they did not say, okay, you can no longer distribute medicine. They said, okay, we're going to make it so that you have to have fully sealed pill bottles that can't be tampered with. Like I often see arguments about, yes, institutions were bad. Yes, there are these problems. There are regulatory and policy solutions to these problems that can be applied. Nothing is going to be perfect, right? These aren't going to work all the time, but you do have to consider that, again, the current choices that we're dealing with are, for many of these people, if they are not in institutions, they are homeless. And like you said, so the New York case of just in general, not everyone is suited for home and community-based services. Like some again, if you think everyone is trying to poison you, you aren't going to eat a meal provided to you by a social worker. If you have delusions that the government is out to get you and is tracking you, there is no amount of home-based care that is going to make you less paranoid, because these are agents of the government that are working with you, right? Like this, yeah. Anyway,
well, you said
yeah,
homeless, but I hope it's better in Canada. But in the United States, the default place for people with untreated severe mental illness is jail. Like a lot of these
yeah.
people are in jail or in prison.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it is. Jail is very much the other place, and so this brings into the next point, which is the loss of freedom and autonomy. And I think the point is, a lot of them get sent to jails instead, is a fairly compelling argument against this. But the argument is, well, like when you go to an institution, your life is regimented. You don't get to choose what you're going to eat. You don't get to go outside. You don't get to choose what you do in your day. People make these decisions for you, and you don't have any say in them, and you have to go along with them. Like if you don't want a treatment in a lot of places, you're getting the treatment whether you want it or not. And you can't choose what you wear. You don't have choices over your own clothes. Again, if you don't like the food, that's not an option for you. And also a loss of privacy, or people make, or like there's also the question that people give you false choices, or like coercion in these institutions, where you don't actually get to choose what you do. You only get to choose one or two things. Like they give you two options and you get to choose which one, and they call it choice. Yeah. So that's the argument about institutionalization, is that like these places suck to be in. What would you say to that?
I'm not arguing for, if you're thriving in a home situation or a group home situation, or if you are thriving or just okay in a less restrictive environment, then that's where I would like you to stay. I'm not talking about restricting people for the sake of it by any stretch of the imagination. I'm only talking about people who are very clearly not thriving in a less restrictive situation. I think a more restrictive situation should either be available to them if they're willing, or in some cases should be compelled if they are not in their right mind to make a choice.
I mean, I think for me personally, the most compelling one is the other option. Again, isn't perfect home-based community services. It's prison. And guess what? Guess what
Right.
else happens in prison? All of
Right.
these things, but often worse, and often much worse for a person with mental health issues. Yeah. Another concern that comes up is that this is segregation, and this is hiding the sad and ugly face of disability from the general public, and will engender a sort of out of sight, out of mind mentality in people. And that this is bad for both the broader population and for the people with these disabilities, for them to be segregated. How do you respond to that one?
I again, this kind of rests on the assumption that we're taking a bunch of people who were able to be out and about in the community and putting them in more restrictive situations than they require. And that's not what's being advocated for here. That's not what I'm saying. I don't think that's what many, if anyone, is saying. We will admit that in what we're advocating for, there will be some people who end up in more restrictive situations than they require, at least for some period of time. That's unfortunate. It's inevitable. But generally speaking, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that people are going to be at the level of restriction that they need, that is best for them. And so, right now, there's special education in school, and those kids are with the other kids when they can be, and they're out in the community when they can be, and the kids that can't be aren't. And that's what would continue to be the case. I don't see why that would need to change. I think the difference is, again, realistically, the people who are decomposing on the streets and in prison would be in institutions, which would be a huge improvement.
Yeah, and I also like to ask these people, have you spent time in group homes for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities? Have you been to like a L'Arche community? So in Canada, I have been to two. I know many people who either have gone to my church or go to a sister church who have intellectual disabilities, who live in a L'Arche community. They love it. They're having a great time in there, right? Like, this is, to be clear, L'Arche is not like a large institution. They are small community-based places where people get lots of autonomy, but also autonomy in the scope that it makes sense for their disability. They don't mind being segregated in their community. Oftentimes, this is where their friends are, right? If you have an intellectual disability, it is a beautiful idea to think that you will just have lots of friends with, you'll be friends with lots of various different people of various different stripes. But the reality is that just isn't usually the case. Typically, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities don't share much in common with people of a similar age, right? So one of my friends lives in a L'Arche community, spends most of his day thinking and talking about the Muppets, which, like, hell yeah, brother, good for you. This is great. Most adults that he will meet who are at his age, so he's older than me, most people who are at his age do not like to do that. People in his community love to do that. And as much as there is, it's like, yeah, okay, so this is segregation to a large extent. But also, this isn't segregation it's not like racial segregation, right? Where racial segregation is being imposed. This is a very different thing that's going on.
Yeah, it goes back to the whole issue of, if you have dyslexia, for example, no, of course you don't want, if you have a child who has dyslexia, of course you don't want them to be tracked into a special education where everyone around them has worse intellectual disabilities than they do. And no, of course. But again, we don't create policy around the least impacted by whatever we're talking about. And so, yeah, like as you're saying, the reality is that a certain amount of segregation, if you want to call it that, or yeah, it's healthy, it's inevitable, it's healthy, it's fine. And so the idea that like everything needs to be integrated, I think it comes from a perspective that is much more representative of the people who need the least support.
Yeah, and so this often comes from people who have like physical disabilities, right? Like they're in a wheelchair. And because they're in a
Right.
wheelchair, they can't access, a building or something like that. And as a result, they get pushed out of the community
Right.
because there are physical barriers to their entry. I think it's important to acknowledge that physical disabilities and intellectual disabilities are different classes of things, right? Like
Yes.
you can have serious physical disability but still have a very coherent understanding of what's going on, and segregation from the general population is very painful and very lonely and very isolating. I just I, so I recommend people, even though I understand it's a very controversial book in disability communities, it is one worth reading, called Chasing the Intact Mind by Dr. Amy Lutz. I had her on the podcast. You can listen to that episode if you'd like. A lot of people assume that intellectual disability does not come with an actual intellectual disability. Like, a lot of them assume an intact mind. And while it's always great to assume an intact mind, it is necessary to verify after a certain point that someone actually does or does not. And intellectual disabilities just aren't of the same class that a physical disability is. Like, most.
I have a funny story about that, actually. Or I don't know if
Go
it's
for
going to
it.
be funny to anybody else, but I think it's kind of funny. Cut it out if it's not.
Sure.
You know your audience. But I have a friend who uses a walker to get around, and I used to go to orgies in the Bay Area, and we would have them at the same space every month. And I finally got her to come to one of my the orgies that I went to. And together we learned that the space was not accessible. Uh, One of the problems was there was an elevator, but the organizers had set out the squish in such a way as you couldn't really use the elevator, for example. And so that sucked. I was not aware of that, and I felt really embarrassed, and I was glad that, she brought that up, and we fixed it. Now, I wanted her to be able to participate fully in that experience. If she'd had a profound intellectual disability, I would not have wanted her. She would not have been able to fully participate in that experience consensually. So it's different.
Yeah. No. Yes. Tune into Christianity on the Spectrum, where you can hear more about the ability of disabled people to access orgies. We have it all here on this podcast. Anyway,
don't say I'm not an advocate.
Hey, I've never accused you of not wanting to make orgies accessible to the disabled, but I think that is a good point, right? Like, I think that for things like that, there's a commercial. Have you seen that Down syndrome commercial? That's like, don't assume, or
Yes.
because, yeah.
Yes.
I have issues with that commercial. Some of the points are valid, right? Like, so the assumption is, if a person assumes you lack the ability, they're never going to push you. They're never going to try to educate you, and you just won't develop. But also, in that, they're like, you assume I can't have sex, and it's like, yes, for good reasons. This is not something that we should just be assuming everyone should be doing. There are consequences to this. There are many layers of complexity to this one specific facet of society that we really need to consider, and an intellectual disability prevents you from considering those things. There is a documentary I've talked about on this podcast a few times called Tell Them You Love Me, which is about facilitated communication and the sexual abuse of a mentally disabled man by a disability rights advocate who did not accept that this person was mentally disabled and repeatedly sexually assaulted them. This is really bad. And like, as much as like your disability accessibility for orgies story is kind of funny, like, these are like practical considerations, that physical disabilities and intellectual disabilities are in different classes. But yeah, anyway, so the final concern, which we already touched on, is questions of wealth disparity. So historically, institutionalization basically came for poor and marginalized people. It was the families that couldn't take care of a child that got sent to institutions, or got sent to the overcrowded and underfunded institutions. There are a lot of examples of this, a lot of examples of poor people with mild learning disabilities being sent to institutions that they should never have been sent to. Lots of really bad examples of this. And yeah, I mean, I think that's bad. I think that having massive wealth disparities affecting your life is not a good thing. unfortunately, this is kind of a feature of a capitalist society, right? Like your access to capital is contingent on a lot of your access to services.
Well, let's talk about like tradition. I think it's been really interesting, like reading about Renaissance and medieval periods.
Oh yeah.
So
So feudalism, by the way, is much worse than capitalism. This is not a capitalism bad. This is a capitalism improvement on feudalism. Let's not go back to feudalism before anyone misinterprets that statement.
yeah, so one thing that's really interesting is that people with means would send their inconvenient female family members to monasteries. And so if you came from a lot of money, you would go to a really great monastery and you would often have positions of a lot of autonomy, leadership. You'd get treated very well. It would be a very good time. If you had medium money, maybe you're doing some work for the monastery while you're there. If you came from no money, you're doing a lot of work and you better act right because you're there by the charity of the nuns who had money. And so that's a thing. And then also in Europe in the Renaissance period, families usually didn't raise their own children. They would send their children off to a particular, usually like a dowager aunt, and all the family members would send their kids, and then she would kind of raise all the kids together. So yeah, this idea that like there was always one way that it got done and it's the right way. It's, that's not my reading of history. These problems have always existed. Different people at different times have solved these problems in different ways, but the two things that are kind of always the same are it's never been perfect and it's always been very different according to power.
And again, this is sort of one of those problems where structural man comes in and flies in and says the problem is wealth disparity. It's like, cool. So how theoretically are we going to solve wealth disparity? How are we actually going to implement this? My solution would be to just have much better funding for institutions so that wealth disparity concerns become less. Like I am in favor of a strongly supported social safety net, and that social safety net includes mental health care institutions, and that would mitigate it. It would not solve it fully. Like, right? There is, when you're talking about solving problems like wealth inequality, we are at a scope and a level of change and difference that is going to be sort of overwhelming, and I don't necessarily think feasible. Yeah, so that's, I mean, do you have anything else you wanted to add on the various objections that exist?
I think if you want to work at the level of systems, I think that's beautiful and wonderful. And I encourage you to do that. I think in that case, then remove yourself from the conversation of trade offs and let people who are willing to think through the realities of what we do right now, because people are dying right now. Like, those people don't have time to fix society as a whole and abolish capitalism and do whatever we need to do. So for the people, and if you have been traumatized by the mental wellness system or an institution or whatever, to the point where you are not capable of thinking through trade-offs, I'm sorry that happened to you, and that's awful. But you need to I would prefer that you just remove yourself from the conversation, because again, like, this is a conversation where progress can be made. We can save lives. We can make life better for people, but it will not be perfect. We will have to make trade-offs. So for the people who are willing and able to have a conversation about trade-offs, that's the conversation that needs to be had. And if we continue to not have it, people will continue to die and lead miserable lives that they don't need to be living.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think that sometimes people, especially people who are not having to deal with the actual policy trade-offs themselves, this is something that happens a lot there. If you don't actually have a stake in trying to make changes, radical rhetoric feels amazing, right?
Yeah.
To just go on Twitter and yell at someone for being an idiot because they aren't being as radical as you or because they're making a bad decision. But when you actually sort of get in the trenches and have to make the decisions that you make in the trenches, radical rhetoric becomes pretty useless, I have found. I think like one of the really big problems with the neurodiversity movement in general is that it's has really lofty rhetoric, great things to say about all sorts of things. None of them survive contact with reality. Like no good plan survives first contact with the enemy. No good radical rhetoric survives first contact with reality. This is sort of my experience, at least.
No, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and so I want to give some examples of that. Just the Autistic Self Advocacy Network, which is mostly made up of people with ASD1 advocating for everyone with autism. This is what they have to write about institutionalizations. They have a toolkit for self advocacy about institutionalization. And they say they are hardcore against institutionalization, like even small group homes. They have case studies where they talk about various situations, and they consider like a small community based group home of less than 10 people institutionalization and something that needs to be undone. That's their rhetoric. In practice, they do work a lot with various communities, so they'll work with L'Arche. They will work with a lot of places to do boring small policy improvements to give people more autonomy where it makes sense. So they will that's where a lot of their advocacy actually turns into policy. However, in their self advocacy rhetoric toolbook, they are basically like, actually, this is terrible, and no one should be doing institutionalizations. It's often like, I compare it a lot to abolish the police rhetoric. You know, when people are like, abolish the police, get rid of the police, and then you go, okay, well, what are we going to do actually now? Like, how are we actually going to solve this problem? And instead of abolishing the police, it's like, okay, so we're increasing funding to social services. That's actually what they mean when they say abolish the police.
It's also similar in that you ask them, well, why? Well, because the police are terrible to low income people of color. And then you say, well, what do low income people of color want? More police.
Yes. Yes. This is a very controversial thing. But in one of the documentaries about Fairview that exist in the world, they do have a section at the end where they talk about a lot of people who the institution closed and they were kind of sad about it. They were like, "Oh, this is where my friends were." A lot of them just were sent back home to a home that could not support them. I find in a lot of places there was a lot of radical rhetoric about like, we need to abolish the institution and replace it with social services. And this is something you pointed out at the beginning. But often it's like, yes, we got rid of the institution, and okay, we also didn't replace it with social services. So now we just have a bunch of people floating in the ocean, dying, sometimes quite literally. And like, you know, this is just the reality of it. So anyway, I'll read to you this statement. This statement is written in very plain English and simplified English because it is for people with intellectual disabilities. So keep in mind, they do have other documents that aren't like this, but I think this is a good example because this is often what people will use when sending people to advocate for themselves. This is the toolkit they're giving them. I think it's worth reading. So some people say certain people with disabilities can't live in community. They say that some people with disabilities have to live in institutions. They think some people can only get help they need in an institution. I think that would describe us pretty well.
Yep.
Some people with disabilities need a lot of help to live in community. People with intellectual disabilities might need more help, or non-speaking people might have a hard time showing others what they need. But that does not mean these people with disabilities need to live in an institution. Everyone should get to live in community. The studies show everyone should live in community too. The studies found that living in community is better for everyone. It helps everyone make choices, learn new things, and be more safe. It doesn't matter what kind of disability someone has. people with intellectual disabilities, non-speaking people, and other people need a lot of help, all do better in community. Nobody needs to be in an institution. So this study, by the way, is based on a policy document, which is much more verbose and much harder to summarize. This is sort of their synthesis of it. But, they have documents about HBCS, so home and community-based services. And in that, they basically say, yeah, look at all these people whose outcomes were significantly improved by home and community-based services. You should look at the people they surveyed. You should look at the population and ask, how many of those people were violent schizophrenics? How many of those people had paranoid delusions? Is everyone better? Right?
It's also just a false dichotomy. Like that's not it. Like institution versus community is a false dichotomy. Yeah. That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. It's institution, community, homeless, prison, dead, hospital. There are all sorts of solutions here. Community is a great option, but keep in mind, there are like 5 other things out there.
It's not mutually exclusive with what we're talking about really is, when I use the term reinstitutionalization, I needed a headline, but like what I'm actually advocating for is more options for places for people to go and a greater ability to compel them to go there. And so I'm not saying they shouldn't be in the community. I love group homes. I think group homes are great. I think institutions should be in communities. Like, I think we should build enough that they can be near their families to the extent that's possible. Well, what I'm saying is that there just aren't enough places for people to go, and it's too hard to compel them to stay there beyond 48 hours. That's not in opposition to being in the community by any stretch of the imagination. Like, that's just not either or.
Yes, but I mean, I would also point out some people in community light their homes on fire. They should not be living in that home if they're lighting it on fire. That's
not because they're in community. It's because they're not being supervised. Exactly. You can be supervised in community, and that's what people need.
Right, and like, there are all sorts of. I mean, I just think the idea that you do studies on groups of people who are not representative of the whole, and or with levels of support services that aren't going to be universally offered. If you, let's say you do a study and it's home-based community services and they are maximal, like you get basically everything that you absolutely need, and a person thrives there, it's like, great, awesome. Can we scale this? Like a lot of the studies simply aren't scalable. Like they are feasible in very small groups for very small amounts of people. They're very resource intensive. And it's like, do we have a way to scale this? And the answer is pretty much always no. Like this worked in this very specific instance in a low sample group because we were able to basically dedicate 20 times the resources that we would normally dedicate to these situations, or 20 times the resources that an institution would have available to it. And it's like, well, what if you gave institutions 20 times the resources that they currently have, or even just 10 times the resources that they have, or 5 times, or just double it? Like, have you run those studies as well? Have you? Because when you're talking about scale, there are like millions of people that you are potentially dealing with who have disabilities, and these millions of people have a very broad range of abilities, and it's necessary to ask, is this going to work for the millions of people that exist, or did this work for 12 people in a pilot program? Right? Because if it was 12 people in a pilot program, you should probably not make broad statements about like everyone does better, especially if that's not a representative group of people. But anyway.
Going back to how do we make sure that nobody is under more supervision than they require, the example of New York bringing people out of supervision who then turned out to need supervision, that's kind of how you would probably do it in the real world. Is you would run experiments. You would be more restrictive and be less restrictive and see what happens. And that's kind of the best we can hope for. We know how to do it. We'll get better at it over time. Going back to the, putting people into supervision that they don't necessarily consent to, or putting them in institutions where they used to be in homes, will make the problem invisible. I didn't know that a fifth of Americans care for a disabled family member. I think we already have a situation in which what's happening is out of sight, and that's a huge problem.
Yeah, and I mean, so I've talked to quite a few families with people who have children who have profound autism, and they basically don't go out. They don't go to restaurants. They don't go anywhere because their child has such a significant disability. Basically, the only people they know, other than people at their church, are other families of disabled people. Because the reality is, most places are not accessible to someone who is ASD3. Like, just good luck. Some places definitely are, and there are improvements being made all the time. But like, segregation is already here, whether you like it or not.
Isolation is already happening, right?
Yeah. Finally, the critique that gets leveled at me all the time, which I would like to address, is the cycle of institutions. So the cycle of institutions is what is explained by Asan here in this document. I'll read it. In this toolkit, we talk about cycles of institutions. A cycle is when something happens over and over again. The cycle of institutions is when institutions keep closing and opening again, and has happened many times in the US. Here's what the institution looks like. A new institution gets made. People say they aren't like the old institutions, or that they aren't institutions at all. They say these new places will actually help people with disabilities, but they look and act a lot like the old institutions. Step 2, people with disabilities get sent to the new institutions, and they don't actually get help. They don't get to go to school, learn how to do jobs, or learn how to live on their own. They start to get hurt in the new institutions, just like in the old ones. Step 3, people start to notice how bad the institutions are. The government workers might visit one, or reports show up on a newspaper or TV, and people say something needs to be done about these institutions. And step 4, people try to think of a new way to help people with disabilities. They can't think of a way to help us to live in community, so they come up with a new kind of institution. I believe we're on step 4 here. So what would you say about this, our new proposal? Are we in the cycle of institutions? My response to this type of thing is, was the problem the institution, or was the problem the gutting of federal funding and chronic understaffing? And like, was the problem with an institution? It's as a concept.
I don't understand the alternative. So, okay,
the alternative is live in community. As we've explained, there are many issues with that.
The alternative is the status quo. Like, you're either trying shit or you're not. So sure, you could make an argument that trying shit is cyclical, but we haven't invented an entirely new way to deal with shit. So there's going to be a cyclicality to anything that we try, because we only have access to what we can imagine. So there'll be aspects of it that are new, I'm sure. There's new drugs, new treatments, but at the end of the day, like, there are only so many ways to house a person. That's the best you can hope for in reality, is you try new things, you try old things in a different way, you try old things maybe it'll work this time, but you iterate and pivot, or you accept the status quo. I don't think accepting the status quo is an acceptable answer. I think you try new things with some old things mixed in, and learn from what hasn't worked, and it'll never be perfect, but it'll get better.
Yeah, so I have a similar point to that, and my point is, you can replace institution with medicine, and it would be the exact same argument, right? or psychiatrics, or
education, or anything that's a solution to a problem.
Literally, you could put in any sort of societal-wide issue into here, and it would still, the critique would still work. And like you said, this isn't an issue with the thing itself. This is an issue with complex human problems and society-wide issues of living in a complex, hundreds of millions of people society where people have competing needs and complex issues that are going on. Like this, I don't know. I think the cycle of institutions is very frustrating because, like you said, the alternative, I mean, in their mind, the alternative is HCBS across the board. It's like, great, love that for you. We don't have that. We're not getting that anytime soon. The amount, it doesn't scale at the same rate that other things scale. I would love to stop all wars. I would love world peace. We're not getting world peace. And so in the absence of getting world peace, we have to come up with a solution. And this solution might suck for a lot of people. And inevitably, there are going to be people who fall through the cracks. There are going to be people who get hurt. There is no way around pain. There is no way around suffering. This is the way of the world, unfortunately. Bad things happen and bad things will continue to happen. And there is going to be no world in which this doesn't happen. And like you said, the actual other option to this is just the status quo, to keep doing what we're already doing. And I think it's worth at least giving things a try and making things better. I'm a big proponent of communities like L'Arche. I think they're great. I think there should be more of them, and they should get better funding. That's basically what I would say is small community-based homes and support services where possible, but also an acknowledgement. Not everyone's going to be able to live there. Some people with violent delusions cannot be in L'Arche because they will hurt the other vulnerable people there. And you need some sort of solution. And I think institutionalization is a reasonable solution to a bad problem that is not going to be perfect and will inevitably hurt people. But there is no way to come up with a solution that isn't going to. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Do you have any final parting thoughts?
There's a place for utopian thinking, and it's fiction. There's a place for solutions that don't involve trade-offs, but it's not policy. So
yeah. Yep. All right. That is the episode. If you would like to find me, you can find me on Twitter at ChristianityOn. You can find me on Blue Sky at christianityon.bluesky.social. If you'd like to email me, you can email me at christianityonthespectrum.com. We have a Discord. If you'd like to join the Discord, message me on one of those places, and I will send you a link. Cathy, do you have anything you'd like to plug?
Absolutely. I have a newsletter. It's awesome. Thousands of people subscribe. It is at cathyreisenwitz.substack.com, or you can just Google Cathy Reisenwitz. I'm also on Twitter at Cathy Reisenwitz. And check me out, read my stuff, comment, like, subscribe.
Cool. Also do the same for me. I always forget to tell people to do that anyway. And I get emails. I get emails from SEO people being like, do you know you can make this better by actually promoting or telling people to interact with your podcast? Anyway, that's it. Donate to the Against Malaria Foundation. We're almost at $5,000. That's awesome. That's it. All right. See ya. Editing John here. You could tell how long ago we recorded this episode. We're well over 22,000 now.